to Boaventura de Sousa Santos and hear more about learned ignorance, the gold method of intercultural translation.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. And yes, my take on translation is a rather specific one. And it has, of course, connections and affinities where the approach is by rather, of course, in a fundamental book on translation with Etienne Balibar, also in his book, and very especially also with my colleague Françoise Vergès here today for the things that she decided to discuss today. Well, I see the interculture, even though my summary probably doesn't deal with it specifically, it's learned ignorance. I'll explain what that is. I'm concerned with intercultural and interpolitical translation as an epistemic and political move to break the cognitive barriers that keep social movements apart and prevent them from coalescing in liberatory struggles. So I'm very much concerned with a specific, well, it's an important topic for me, of course, but it's a very specific problem. Is the social struggles, how the different movements and organizations that are apparently struggling for the same objectives, they divide themselves and they don't coalesce because they have different knowledges, different narratives, different purposes, different languages, different metaphors, and therefore it is impossible to combine the struggles because there are lots of stereotypes, prejudices among popular classes, among different kinds of knowledges. So as you can see, my experience and theoretical experience come from my practice with social movements and my work with them, and particularly after the World Social Movement, the World Social Forum that started meeting in 2001, and in which we saw thousands of movements and organizations coming together with very different narratives and languages, impossible, in fact, to understand, but really coalescing in the idea that another world is possible. There is to say a struggle for liberation against domination, however you define it. But then that was the first moment, was a glorious moment. But then we could see the dispersion, the incapacity of getting together, of organizing themselves, of becoming a political subject. So I saw that there was some intervention here needed, and my theory has been working on this precisely to see that I saw in a diversity of knowledges brought in struggle. And among those knowledges, modern science. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to be anti-science because in all the struggles I've been involved, science is very much part of it. But of course, it's not the only valid knowledge. There are many other valid knowledge that are involved in social struggles. And therefore, it's important to know how the science and other knowledges can talk, negotiate meanings so that they can strengthen the social struggles for liberation in this so unequal society. So some of you may know that, you know, in doing this, I had to decolonize my Marxist training, which was basically a Marxist training, basically to see that there are three modes of domination, three main modes of domination in Western modernity: capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And they work together. And of course, we can even follow a labor theory of value. Sylvia Federici, for instance, does that, in which you can see how, in fact, my dear friend Veronica Gago is going to speak here, and please pay attention to her. It's a great intellectual, a rising star in Latin America. So I think it's very important for us to see that the three modes of domination work together. They combine. In a book it's coming out by Routledge, From Pandemic to Utopia is the title of that book. I tried to show in empirical terms how during the pandemic, when capitalism became more aggressive, immediately racism also increased, and colonialism in general, but racism and sexism. For instance, feminicide, violence against women, And the first data, in fact, came from France and from Canada, right after the confinement. That is to say, the three modes of domination work together. And the drama of our time, in my view, is that while domination works articulated in a combination, resistance is fragmented. All the time is fragmented. How many feminist movements have been racist and pro-capitalist? How many anti-racial movements have been sexist and pro-capitalist? How many anti-capitalist movements, trade unions, and so on, have been racist and sexist? That is to say, resistance is fragmented, domination is articulated. And as long as you find this discrepancy, I think we cannot get out of domination, of Western-centric domination. So I think that I discovered there were two fault lines, not just one, as I had done in my previous epistemological work, but two fault lines. The first fault line, of course, is between academic work and knowledge and scientific knowledge and popular vernacular, popular urban, rural, feminist, cooperative knowledge that you can find in social life. And this is a very important fault line. But the other fault line is among the different popular knowledges, feminist knowledges, rural knowledges, landless movement knowledge with indigenous knowledge, different conceptions of land, different conceptions of territory, different conceptions of nature. How can we come together if we have so many differences that create, in fact, stereotypes? For instance, there was a time in which the feminists in Latin America, for instance, Veronica is a young one, but later on, some in the 80s or 90s, I mean, for them, the indigenous people were the most male chauvinist pigs of the world. So how could the feminist movement get together with the indigenous movement in a struggle, for instance? So these were the things that I've been confronted, and I've been working on them to rediscover platforms of negotiation, of meeting. So it has nothing to do with the colonial translation, subject-object translation that is very prevalent in our state. So I think that from then on, I could see that in this idea, I even came to be a bit critical, in fact, critical of some versions of the decolonial anti-Eurocentrism, because they usually make a caricature of the Western-centric knowledge. And all we know, the Western-centric knowledge is very complex. And in my work, I came to know that probably before the Enlightenment, we find philosophers, scholars, theologians that may help us to understand the epistemic diversity of the world and how we can, in fact, communicate among different knowledges in a kind of an intercultural and interpolitical disposition. A disposition to create a kind of an hospitable othering, as Baliba would say, or not an hostile one at least, right? And I really discovered long ago, in fact, but I've been working with him very closely, is Nicholas of Cusa. Nicholas of Cusa wrote in 1440 a marvelous book called Docta Ignorantia. And this book, what it says basically is that what we should know is our ignorance of knowledge. That means the conscious of ignorance. And the more we ignore, the more we know. And the more we know, the more we ignore. That is to say, all systems of knowledge are incomplete. And therefore, what we should do is to be very much aware of the knowledges that we ignore. And the more reliable is our knowledge, the most learned ignorant it is. So Nicholas of Cusa, of course, was very much concerned with absolute knowledge, with the divine knowledge. Well, for me, that's my take on Nicholas of Cusa, is not infinite knowledge or the divine logic or absolute truth, but the infinite diversity of the world, the epistemic diversity of the world. That's what I've been confronted all over my life. And therefore, it's very important to confront this diversity and see how we can move along without ignoring it, without relativism, but with lots of relativity. not relativism, but relativity, of course. So he distinguishes two kinds of ignorance. The ignorant ignorance, which is the ignorant that does know that he or she ignores. And in fact, Western-centric knowledge, the dominant versions were very much ignorant of ignorance that is ignorant of itself. That is to say, they know this kind of knowledge, knows and thinks that the only knowable things are the things that this knowledge can know. And beyond that, there is nothing worth knowing. And in fact, we can see that particularly from 17th and 18th century onwards. So this has created a kind of monocultures in knowledge, in social practice, in conceptions of time, in conceptions of productivity, in conceptions of scale. And I try to identify 5 of them for you in a moment. So what was interesting, fascinating to me, is that Nicholas of Cusa could have an horizontal dialogue with Al-Ghazali, the great Islamic scholar, Persian, and you know, from that you know very well, it was also a theologian in Islam. Well, in the 15th century, was possible, like Spinoza a bit later, but Cusa could have such an horizontal dialogue that basically later on in the 18th century became impossible. That is to say, these are the contradictions. And when we see that this, so what, the transition from the pre-modern to the modern, we find the jewels of a kind of a cosmopolitanism that we could not find elsewhere. So based on Nicholas of Cusa, and I'm going very fast so that I don't overstep my time, I discovered, and I've been working on the following principles for intercultural, interpolitical translation out of thousands of sessions with organizations, different organizations, movements, breakups of conversation, divorces, things like that, that we find everywhere when you are really in the struggle. So the first one is, of course, that all cultures are incomplete. Because if a given culture has satisfactory answers to all our questions, we don't need intercultural translation or interpolitical translation. So there are things that a given culture cannot respond. I'll try to exemplify some of them, but in the case of science, it's very clearly, and I learned that from Karl von Weizsäcker, when I was at the Max Planck Institute in Glasgow, in Munich, that science can only respond to the questions that can be formulated scientifically. And therefore, there is a kind of a spiral in our epistemologies that make it difficult to bring in different kinds of knowledges. And Karl von Weizsäcker asked us, what is the sense of doing science? He was, a famous physicist. And of course, his question was, well, we cannot respond that in scientific terms. It's not a scientific question. And the questions that we cannot formulate in scientific terms, we turn away from them. We don't consider them relevant. Well, that's the problem with the monocultures of Western-centric knowledge. The second principle is the enigma, which is very, very prevalent in Cusa and in my work, is that it is as plausible to view life as a unity as a diversity. And from the beginning, when we are with movements of organizations, we see that enigma navigating in the heads of people. Some of them tend to see life as a unity, others as a diversity. I come to the conclusion that we start usually when we are foreigners to each other, when we are very strangers, so to say, when the othering is at the highest, we start with dispersion. We see the diversity of things, but we don't see the connection between the things. So the process of intercultural translation is a movement from dispersion to bond. What is the bond, the connection that may create identity without fusion, without messiness, without lack of respect for the other. In dealing with my personal communications with the elders, the indigenous elders of knowledge, of course, I cannot really cite a personal communication as if it were a tweet, because it's really trivializing some personal communication that communicates to me so many different registers, cognitive registers, aesthetic registers, spiritual registers, historical registers. It's not a tweet. So we tend, not because it's not written knowledge, and of course we have, you assume, the priority of written knowledge in relation to oral knowledge. So I think that we have to start for a third assumption. Recognition comes before cognition. We have to recognize the other before we know it very well. So this is the pre-understanding, the Vorverständnis, as it says in German philosophy, the Vorverständnis of this basic human that is possible to develop this bond. In order to move along, we have to have the conception that Sousa calls the Conjexiones, the conjectures. That is to say, the way of intensifying intersubjectivity goes by phronesis, not by apodictic knowledge. Because usually if you use an intercultural, interpolitical translation, apodictic knowledge, we exclude immediately some people from the conversation. And we have to bring in so that we can then make our hierarchies among different knowledge for the different purposes in which we are involved. The fourth assumption is that I've come to the conclusion that there are basically 4 monocultures to which we should counterpose through intercultural translation 5 ecologies. Well, I've written extensively about that. I just summarized them very briefly here. One is, the first one is the monoculture of rigorous knowledge. And therefore, I counterpose to it the ecologies of knowledges, which are developed through intercultural translation. The second one is the monoculture of the linear time, to which I also counterpose the ecologies of temporalities that we can find everywhere. In fact, linear time is a very exceptional conception of time. The third one is the monoculture of the dominant scale. The global and universal is more precious than the local and particular. Of course, there are hierarchies, but they have to be contextualized, because maybe the opposite in a given struggle. Because if you are in a struggle, you have to distinguish between the important struggles and the urgent struggles. And sometimes the most urgent struggle is not the most important struggle, or we have to bring them along together. When George Floyd was assassinated by the knee of the policeman, at that point, the anti-racial struggle was the most urgent struggle in the United States. But of course, you would have to bring along with the anti-capitalism state, with the anti-capitalist struggle and with the feminist struggle. And in fact, later on, the feminists, trade unions, all joined the George Floyd struggle. So I think that this is the quest for the future, because we are on the borderline of chaos and war again in Europe. And for me, the antidote, I really have some differences when we say that translation is a form of violence. Of course, I respect that, and I know that the brother's work is very telling about that. But my experience is translation as an antidote, as a weapon against violence for intercultural integration. So the dominant scale, the fourth one, is the monoculture of ex natura classifications, nature, society, man, woman, black, white, but we know all this. And the fifth monoculture is the monoculture of productivity, of capitalist productivity. To consider that capitalist productive, that is to say, productivity measured in one single scale of cycle of production is the criterion for productivity of life. Well, most people around the world, they never go by capitalist productivity in their lives, in their land, in their territories, because the land has to rest, for instance, for the peasants around the world. We need to go a multi-cycle as we do in our lives. But in any case, if you go to the business administrations and faculties or economy faculty, you see that is really the single scale, the criteria of productivity. So there are 5 monocultures to which we have to counterpose through translation 5 ecologies. And believe me, many social movements are much more monoculture than you can imagine. So you have the interculture is really a struggle because what we have in common is prospective. There is commonality, is ahead. Very often people, of course, share a past, but we're reinventing it all the time. The 7th assumption is that this sharing, which is also a struggle and is a task, has to take 3 different moments, and they are very specific and they have to be worked out with different strategies of negotiating the translation. The initiative, the monopole of the initiative, the monopole of the selectivity of the occasion, and the monopole of the purpose of translation. We have to go against these 3 monopoles through strategies of sharing and the negotiations, which are not easy, because a given act of conversation of intercultural translation is like a photo. But life and the social life and modern life has been a long film, and therefore there is an history of unequal relations among languages, among narratives, and all of them are brought into the conversation, even they are unsaid. So therefore it's very important to go against this. I have 2 more assumptions, and then I finish. Is that the one of the most difficult tasks once you are entertaining intercultural translation is that some knowledges, particularly Western-centric knowledge, is very good at information and knowledge and very poor at wisdom. So there is a distinction to be made because between information and knowledge on one side and wisdom on the other side. Many other ways of knowing are very rich in wisdom, while our knowledge, the academic Western-centric knowledge is very much richer, and now with the mechanic and artificial intelligence is become really a paroxysm of this, is information and knowledge. But the more knowledge we have and more information we have, less wise we become. Therefore, it's very important, the intercultural translation in this. And this is related to another discrepancy or symmetry, is between the reasoning about the technological skill and the domain of value. Because there are people and groups that think that advantage is basically in technological skill, and therefore they can spare on the domain of value, while others, of course, are not that way, are on the contrary. So I think that to conclude, that the basic asymmetry, and I think that makes me very humble, and that's why I think I always consider myself a rearguard intellectual, is that we lived in one culture only, basically, even we try to be very intercultural. Basically, it's one. Of course, this one is also problematic. Where does intercultural begins and the intracultural ends? We never know, right? But the problem is that while we have a lived experience in a given culture, we have an abstract experience of the other cultures. We don't have the same existential hankering, embodiment in the other culture. So we have this difficulty, and all the others in this intercultural translation suffer from that discrepancy. And therefore, we have to be very careful about this. So finally, if you take all this in consideration, you can see, first of all, in our world, intercultural and interpolitical translation is always reversible. There are not things that you advance and you can consider irreversible. On the contrary, for instance, I see in the movements today, when I deal with feminist movements, with indigenous movement, with all the other movements now, we are going through a period of higher fragmentation than before. We are entering a period of identitarian ghettos that in fact are making it more difficult for us, for the movements, to integrate. So the limits here is that whenever there are limits, don't get discouraged. There are taboos, there are silences, there are parts of a given culture that you never translate. But what you know and what we should know and what usually the movements try to know is the more you know about the other, the more you know about yourself. It's basically about the other knowledge of your own culture that you gain by entertaining intercultural translation. As an illustration, and they are just the topics I show you where I have come across the most difficult issues and most pregnant issues in intercultural translation and interpolitical translation at this point. And they are the following. The nation and plurinationality rather deals with that in her book, Balibar, and well, Balibar with his work with Wallerstein very early on, they were concerned with this. Human rights and rights of nature. What are the rights of nature? There's a big debate now going on this. The concept of nature is a Spinozian concept or a Cartesian concept. And people go from one to the other very often without knowing where they are. Democracy is the fourth one. Time. Time is very much time of debate now with all the discussions on the different conceptions of time. And finally, spirituality, because that's one of the lacks, so to say, of the Western-centric culture and knowledge is the poverty of spirituality, in spirituality. So we started very early on with the early Christians with the spiritual exercises, but this way of knowing was lost in translation after the 17th century. So I think that to conclude, intercultural and interpolitical translation is a quest for what I call a post-abyssal thinking, because the abyssal line that divides the zone of the beings, the full human beings, and the zone of subhumans, the racialized and sexualized populations of our world, the subhumans that drown in the Mediterranean Sea, are the ones, in fact, that we should care about most. And I think that intercultural translation, by developing the epistemic diversity on the other side of the line, what I call the colonial sociability, aims at the post-abyssal sociability and thinking. Thank you very much.